Hi, we're beginning a new series of lessons, a Bible study, midweek lessons on heaven, hell, and in between. It's generally a study of the afterlife as seen in the scriptures. We're going to start in the Old Testament tonight and what the Bible says about that. Um, what does afterlife mean? Um, the biblical writings, do they teach what we call an afterlife? That terminology, afterlife, is not a biblical term, um, but I'm not trying to confuse you here, but it's a little misleading. It's not like afterlife, it's after what? There's several different steps to what happens to us after we die, because this is only this age. There will be different realities for us as we proceed past our physical death, and we're going to look into that. It does appear that the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, teaches that when a person dies, they go to Sheol. At least early in the Old Testament, it teaches that. Sheol means the grave. That's the Hebrew word for grave. It's a place of mystery and darkness and death, obviously. The word Sheol is that Hebrew word for grave, and occasionally in some translations you will see the word Sheol, S-H-E-O-L, that occurs there in the passage in the Old Testament. You won't see it in the New Testament because that's a Hebrew word, and the word Hades, which is the Greek word for the grave or the place of the dead, is what's used in the New Testament. Now, when the ancients died in the book of Genesis, so you're talking about some of the earliest writings in the Bible, you lived and you died, and there was no conversation, or at least none expressly, about what would happen to you when you die. And I think you're going to find as we go through this that although the New Testament opens up new understanding for us about the grave and afterlife, if you will, that the Old Testament keeps us somewhat more in the dark about that. The Old Testament isn't completely silent on the issue. In fact, some of the later books of the Old Testament, like Daniel and Isaiah, speak of a new heavens and a new earth, a new existence after this life, a resurrection from the dead, even as Daniel even prophesies. So the Old Testament is not completely devoid of mentioning what happens after we die. But it is important, I think, to know up front that the Bible progressively reveals more and more about what happens after death. That you start at the beginning of Genesis and there's very little said about it. In fact, a person just lives and dies. I have 3 passages that are examples of this in Genesis chapter 5, verses 5, 8, and 11. In verse 5, he's going down the list of the oldest of old folks, way back, pre-Abraham, where it said in verse 5 of Genesis 5, Adam lived a total of 930 years, and then he died. That's it. And then in verse 8, it says Seth lived a total of 912 years, and then he died. And then in verse 11, Enosh lived a total of 905 years, and then he died. Nothing is said about where his spirit goes. It just says they lived a certain number of years and they died. That is a very plain-spoken way of putting the idea of death. You just die. However, when you get as far as Genesis chapter 25, in referencing Abraham's death, in Genesis 25, verse 7, it says, Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Gathered to his people. And then the same is written of Isaac, Abraham's son, in Genesis chapter 35, verses 28 and 29, where it says, Isaac lived 180 years, then he breathed his last and died and was gathered to his people. We hadn't heard this before Abraham and Isaac. What does that phrase mean? Gathered to his people. John T. Willis, the great Old Testament scholar from Abilene Christian, who wrote a commentary in the Sweet Bible Study series about the book of Genesis and was considered for many years one of the foremost Old Testament scholars, said that there's really three possibilities, main possibilities for what that term means, to die and then be gathered to your people. He summed it up like this: it's just an idiom for being dead. It's kind of like today, an idiom, like they kicked the can, they bought the farm. Those are euphemisms, they are idioms, if you will. And that's a Hebrew idiom. And the second possibility that Willis said was that it means that he was physically buried in the place where his ancestors were buried. And then the third possibility that Willis gives, and several notable scholars, Hebrew scholars, say that this is the case, that when he was buried, his spirit, his personality, his life force went to Sheol. In other words, his body was left dead in the grave, but that his spirit went to be with his ancestors. So that there's this notion gathered to their people that there would be a grand reunion of some kind. And so this is the most primitive, earliest of the Bible mentions of what happens to a person when they die, that they are gathered to their people. Now, if you look closely at that passage in Genesis 35 and recalling the death of Isaac, for instance, it says he died and was gathered to his people, and then his sons, Esau and Jacob, buried him. It seems to some scholars that the writer of Genesis, likely Moses, would have been redundant if that had just been an idiom for death. In other words, if he just said, well, he was dead, he died, and then we buried him, he went to be with his ancestors, to be in the same place where his ancestors are buried, and then for Esau and Jacob then to bury him. You see, you have death, gathered to his people, then buried. So is it possible that being gathered to your people and being buried is actually redundant, that actually is not really doesn't make sense? He's emphasizing the dying part, obviously, but is it possible that before he was buried, his personality, his life force, had already gone to be united with his ancestors? Interesting. And again, we're still talking very early in the Bible about the afterlife, and it doesn't, expressly tell us this. So we have these foreshadowings, this progressive, gradual unveiling of the truth about what happens to us after we die. And we could say that Sheol is the place where the physical body dies, and then the spirit goes to be with one's ancestors, with one's family. It's a very comforting thought to think that reunion is one of the main things that will happen at the time of someone's death. Now, imagine for a moment you are a Jew, and this is all the information that you have in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Scriptures, that this is all the information you have about the afterlife, about what happens after you die. I would tend to cling to the notion that I'm going to be reunited with my family. Now, I want to look at another passage, though, because I'll give you a few examples. It does appear that there is some, apparent contradictions. They're not, but they're apparent contradictions, like in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 5. For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. They have no further reward, and even their name is forgotten. There are some notable denominations, churches, that teach that when you die, you're just dead, that there's no consciousness, nothing, that the dead know nothing. there are a great number of difficulties, I think, with this passage in Ecclesiastes anyway, because here's a man who has written this book of memoirs outlining his quest for life's meaning. And at one point, he's not finished with the journey yet to find life's meaning. And he says, well, I guess when people die, they just don't know anything. It was this is that part of his memoir where he was really despairing of life at all. The dead know nothing. Should we base our doctrines on that particular passage, on the word of what we think is probably King Solomon when he was on his quest for life's meaning and had not arrived at his destination yet? Now, it's no wonder you have Pharisees and Sadducees among the Jews at the time of Jesus. It's no wonder. There is a stark difference between Pharisees and Sadducees. Most of us know what the difference is. Pharisees believed that there was life after death, that there was resurrection, that there was a supernatural angelic creature. Sadducees, on the other hand, did not believe in resurrection, did not believe in an afterlife, did not believe in supernatural angels or angelic beings. By the time you get to Isaiah and Daniel and Zechariah, though, you begin to have more and more of the onion peeled away, those layers being pulled away, so you can begin to see a little bit more of what comes after our lives here on earth. But here's another thing. Here in an early book, probably one of the earliest books in the Old Testament, in Job 19:26, it says, "And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him. With my own eyes, I and not another. How my heart yearns within me." Again, a breadcrumb, if you will. Look, there's coming a resurrection. And here in the Old Testament, that is said. I'm going to see God even after my skin has been destroyed. Now, Jesus settled the matter in a discussion that he had with some Pharisees and Sadducees. Since some didn't believe in the resurrection, the Sadducees, he addressed that issue very directly. He basically told the Sadducees, hey, you're wrong about this. But it's interesting how Jesus uses a passage from Genesis in Mark 12, verse 27. Jesus in this discussion, referencing the ancient patriarchs, actually will be in verse 26. It says, "Now about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses?" This is in Exodus, okay? "Have you not read in Exodus, in the book of Moses, in the law, in the account of the burning bush," it's early Exodus, "how God said to him, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken." Now, it does not expressly say in Exodus at the burning bush that God was saying, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and they're all alive. We don't have that in that text. But Jesus brought light. He shed light on that passage and said, he's not the God. He's not sovereign over dead people. He is sovereign over the living. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive and will be alive at the resurrection. He told Mary that he said, he's not the God of the dead, but of the living. But he said, he that lives and believes in me shall never die. So Jesus shed a bright light on the subject of resurrection, on the subject of life after death, so that we're not left to wonder about the reality of life after death that the Old Testament seems to leave us hanging. It isn't until Jesus is himself risen from the dead that these things become crystal clear to us who are believers. I think we all take for granted as Christians, many of us who are Christians, take for granted that Christ is returning, that the dead will be raised, and that there is a place of rest for the saints of God where there is conscious living going on. We also have Paul's experience of seeing paradise in 2 Corinthians 12, which we will take on in another class. The Jews had, like I said, breadcrumbs in the Old Testament, and then Jesus has the direct finger pointing in the direction. He says, look at the empty tomb and see that there is life after death. Sheol was the end of man to most early Jews and their understanding. But as they lived and as they grew in their knowledge of God, as God inspired men, this was progressively uncovered until the brightness of bright light, Jesus' resurrection, his resurrection itself. There's much mystery about the afterlife. I'm not going to kid you about that, but there is much we can know, and that is going to be the subject of our coming studies. We've been studying from the Old Testament tonight, and we'll be moving into the New Testament and some near-death phenomenon in future classes. I hope that you're able to join us. This is class number 1 in heaven, hell, and in between, and we're glad you came.